Welcome to Whispering Willows Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The fog settled over London like a whispered secret, thick and grey and patient. It curled around the gaslights on Baker Street, softening their glow until each lamp became a small amber moon suspended in the November dusk. The air tasted of coal smoke and a damp wool, that particular flavour of a city folding itself inward for the night, drawing its collars high and its curtains closed. From somewhere distant came the muffled clatter of a hansom cab, its wheels finding the cobblestones with a rhythm that seemed almost musical, almost like a lullaby for a city that never truly slept. Inside the rooms at 221B Baker Street, a fire crackled in the hearth with the kind of contentment only a well-fed fire can possess. The flames danced their slow waltz, casting long shadows that stretched and bent across the walls like drowsy phantoms. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, his grey eyes distant and unfocused in that particular way that meant his mind was wandering through corridors Watson could never quite follow. The detective had been quiet for the better part of an hour, save for the occasional soft sigh or the gentle rustle of his dressing gown as he shifted position. Watson sat opposite, his pen moving across the page in steady strokes, documenting their last case with the methodical care of a man who understood that stories, like patience, required attention to detail. The scratch of nib on paper provided a counterpoint to the fire's whisper, a domestic symphony that filled the room with a sense of peace so complete it felt almost defiant against the sprawling chaos of London beyond their windows. The city itself, that great breathing beast of brick and ambition, stretched out in all directions beneath its blanket of fog. Victorian London, in the final decade of the 19th century, was a study in contrasts, a place where gaslight and shadow competed for dominance on every street corner. The grand edifices of the empire rose like stone prayers toward a soot-stained sky. The Houses of Parliament, with their Gothic spires, the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral presiding over the river like a stern but benevolent grandmother. The British Museum hoarding the world's treasures behind its columned facade. But London was not merely monuments and marble. It was also the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, where the fog grew thicker and the gaslights fewer, where families crowded into single rooms and the scent of poverty hung as heavy as the coal smoke. It was the dockyards along the Thames, where men with calloused hands loaded tea from India and silk from China, while pickpockets worked the crowds with the precision of surgeons. It was the music halls of the West End, where laughter spilled out onto the streets like champagne from a shaken bottle, and the gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall, where silence was preserved as carefully as the brandy. The city pulsed with contradictions. Horse-drawn carriages shared the roads with the occasional experimental motor car, which sputtered and coughed its way through traffic like a mechanical invalid. Ladies in bustles and stays promenaded through Hyde Park, their parasols tilting at precise angles, while in the factories of the East End, Women and children worked 16-hour shifts for wages that barely bought bread. The telegraph wires hummed overhead, carrying messages at the speed of lightning, yet news still spread fastest through the oldest technology of all, gossip, delivered in whispers over garden walls and across shop counters. And on this particular November evening, London was whispering about something new, something that sent delicious shivers down the spines of those who enjoyed a good mystery. The rumour had started in the drawing rooms of Belgravia, that rarefied air where the wealthy gathered to discuss art and scandal with equal enthusiasm. From there, it had trickled down through the social strata like water finding its level, passing from ladies' maids to costermongers, from clerks to cab drivers, gathering embellishments and flourishes at each telling until the truth, whatever it had originally been, was buried beneath layers of speculation and theatrical exaggeration. The story concerned a skull. Not just any skull, mind you, but one that was said to whisper prophecies to those who dared listen. Men of good standing, rational men who kept accounts and attended church and would have scoffed at such superstition over their morning kippers, had reportedly been driven to madness by the thing. It spoke, they said, in the dead of night, revealing secrets that no skull should know, foretelling futures that made grown men weep. Watson had first heard mention of it 3 days prior, at his club, where a fellow medical man had related the tale with the kind of nervous laugh that suggested he didn't quite believe it himself, but wasn't entirely certain he should dismiss it either. The skull, according to this telling, had been inherited from a collector of occult curiosities, a gentleman who had travelled extensively in the Orient, and brought back all manner of peculiar artifacts. The nephew who inherited the collection had placed the skull in his study, thinking it merely an interesting conversation piece, only to find himself plagued by whispers in the night that spoke of sins he thought buried, and futures he feared to face. Within a fortnight, the nephew had aged a decade. His hands trembled when he reached for his teacup. His eyes carried the haunted look of a man who no longer trusted sleep. And when his family finally convinced him to remove the skull from his presence, he had insisted it be done in broad daylight, with witnesses present, as if the thing might protest its relocation. Watson had mentioned this tale to Holmes over breakfast the following morning, expecting his friend to dismiss it with one of his characteristic remarks about the credulity of the masses. But Holmes had merely raised an eyebrow, buttered his toast with deliberate care, and said nothing at all, which, Watson had learned over the years, was often more significant than speech. Now, as the fire settled into its evening rhythm, and the fog pressed itself against the windows like a curious ghost, Watson set down his pen and cleared his throat. "Holmes," he ventured, "have you heard anything more about this business with the whispering skull?" Holmes stirred from his reverie, his eyes focusing on Watson with the sudden intensity of a hawk spotting movement in the grass. "Ah," he said softly, "so you've been thinking about it too?" "It's been the talk of half of London," Watson replied. "Even my most level-headed colleagues are discussing it. Though I must confess, I find the whole thing rather absurd. A skull that whispers prophecies? It's the stuff of penny dreadfuls, not rational inquiry." "And yet," Holmes murmured, unfolding himself from his chair with the languid grace of a cat who has decided there might be something interesting worth investigating after all. "Rational men are suffering genuine distress. The symptoms you describe, trembling, insomnia, premature aging, these are not fabricated. Something is causing very real psychological harm, Watson. The question is not whether the phenomenon exists, but rather what mechanism underlies it. He moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to gaze out at the fog-shrouded street below. A lamplighter was making his rounds, his ladder and pole silhouetted against the gaslight like some biblical figure ascending toward illumination. Holmes watched him for a moment, his profile sharp against the dim glow from outside. "The human mind," he continued, "is a curious instrument. It can be fooled, manipulated, led down dark corridors of its own making. Fear is a powerful architect, Watson. It builds prisons without bars, creates monsters from shadows. If men believe a skull whispers to them, if they have been primed to expect prophecies and doom, well, the mind is quite capable of providing exactly what it expects to encounter." "So you think it's suggestion?" Watson asked. "Mass hysteria of some sort?" "I think," Holmes said, turning back from the window, "that there are several possibilities, and none of them require supernatural intervention, which makes the phenomenon all the more interesting. When we eliminate the impossible, what remains must be the truth, however be improbable, and I find improbable truths far more engaging than impossible fictions." He returned to his chair, reaching for his pipe from the side table. The ritual of filling and lighting it was one Watson had observed countless times, and there was something soothing about its familiarity. The careful selection of tobacco from the Persian slipper, where Holmes kept his supply, the tamping down with a practised thumb, the scratch of match against box, the first few puffs until the ember glowed steady and true. "Consider the facts as we know them," Holmes said, smoke wreathing his words like punctuation. "Multiple men, all of seemingly sound mind and good reputation, report experiencing the same phenomenon. They hear whispers emanating from a specific object, a human skull. These whispers reveal information that the victims believe to be private, even secret. The psychological impact is severe and consistent across subjects, and yet, when the skull is removed from their presence, they gradually recover their equilibrium." "When you lay it out like that," Watson admitted, "it does suggest some consistent cause beyond mere superstition." "Precisely, which means there is a mystery here worth investigating. Not a supernatural mystery, but something far more intriguing, a mystery of method. How does one create the impression of a whispering skull? And more importantly, why?" The fire crackled in agreement, sending up a small shower of sparks that glowed briefly before fading to ash. Outside, the fog had thickened, transforming Baker Street into something from a dream, or perhaps a memory, of a place that had never quite existed, except in that peculiar space between waking and sleep. Watson leaned back in his chair, suddenly conscious of how comfortable he was, how the warmth from the fire seemed to seep into his very bones. "You think someone is orchestrating this, that it's deliberate?" "I think," Holmes said quietly, "that coincidence is the refuge of lazy minds. When multiple men suffer the same specific delusion involving the same specific object, one must consider the possibility of a guiding hand. But we're speculating without data, Watson, and speculation is a poor foundation for deduction. We need more information." As if summoned by Holmes's words, the sound of footsteps echoed on the stairs outside their door. They were heavy footsteps, laden with purpose, and perhaps a touch of desperation. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up. offering polite protests that were clearly being overridden by urgency. A moment later, a sharp knock rattled the door. "Come," Holmes called, his eyes already bright with the anticipation of a new puzzle. The door opened to reveal a gentleman of middle years, well-dressed but dishevelled in that particular way that suggested he had been well-dressed several hours ago, but had since experienced something that made proper attire seem rather beside the point. His collar was askew, his waistcoat buttoned incorrectly, and his eyes carried that same haunted quality Watson had heard described in the rumours about the skull's victims. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice rough as gravel, "I apologize for the intrusion at this hour, but I was told, that is, I heard that you might be able to help with matters of an unusual nature." Holmes gestured to the chair Watson had just vacated, while Watson himself moved to pour brandy from the decanter on the sideboard. "Please, sit. You look as though you've had quite an ordeal. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. And you are?" "Pemberton," the man said, sinking into the chair as though his strings had been cut. "Richard Pemberton of Belgravia. And yes, Mr. Holmes, I have indeed had an ordeal that I fear may cost me my sanity if it continues much longer." He accepted the brandy Watson offered with trembling hands, taking a long sip before continuing. "I've come about the skull, Mr. Holmes, the whispering skull. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I know. But I'm at my wit's end, and you're my last hope of making sense of what's happening in my house." Holmes settled back into his chair, fingers steepled once more, his expression one of focused attention. "I had wondered when someone might come to me about that particular matter. Tell me everything, Mr. Pemberton, from the beginning, if you please, and spare no detail, no matter how trivial it may seem." Outside, the fog pressed closer still, and somewhere in the distance a clock tower chimed the hour. London breathed on, indifferent to mysteries and madness alike, while in the warm glow of 222 Baker Street, another story began to unfold, slow and patient as the fog itself, waiting to reveal its secrets to those with the wit and will to uncover them. Richard Pemberton sat in the firelight, the brandy glass cradled between his palms as though it was something precious and fragile, like hope itself. The flames painted shadows across his face, highlighting the lines that worry and sleeplessness had etched there. He was perhaps 45, Watson estimated, though at the moment he looked closer to 60. His hands, when they weren't occupied with the brandy, had a tendency to flutter toward his collar, his cuffs, his watch chain, the nervous gestures of a man who no longer trusted the solidity of the world around him. Holmes waited with that particular stillness he possessed when a case had caught his interest. It was not the stillness of patience, exactly, but rather the coiled alertness of a hunting cat who knows that any movement might startle the prey into silence. Watson had learned to recognize this quality in his friend, this ability to make silence itself feel like an invitation to speak. "It began 6 weeks ago," Pemberton said at last, his voice steadier now that the brandy had done its work, "with my uncle's death. Augustus Pemberton. Perhaps you've heard of him?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "The collector. He specialized in Oriental antiquities, if I recall correctly. Spent the better part of 30 years traveling between Tibet, India, and the far reaches of the Himalayas." "You know of him, then?" Pemberton's relief was palpable. "That makes this easier, somehow." "Yes, Uncle Augustus was, well, Obsessed is perhaps not too strong a word. He believed that the ancient civilizations possessed knowledge that we moderns had lost, that there were secrets hidden in their artifacts and relics. He spent his fortune accumulating objects that he believed held power. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the building a door closed with a gentle thump. London murmured beyond the windows, its voice muffled by fog and distance. "He never married," Pemberton continued. "No children. I was his only nephew, and we were never particularly close. He found my interest in banking tedious, and I found his occult obsessions rather embarrassing, if I'm honest. But blood is blood. And when he died last month in Calcutta, I inherited everything. His house in Bloomsbury, his investments, and—" he paused, taking another sip of brandy, "and his collection." "Which included the skull in question," Holmes prompted gently, "among hundreds of other items. The house is like a museum, Mr. Holmes. Every room crammed with masks and statues, scrolls and tablets, objects whose purpose I couldn't begin to guess. The solicitor who handled the estate recommended I engage an expert to catalogue it all properly, perhaps arrange for the British Museum to acquire the more significant pieces. It seemed like sound advice at the time." Watson settled into a chair near the fire, his physician's instincts noting the way Pemberton's breathing had quickened, the slight tremor that had returned to his hands despite the brandy. Whatever the man had experienced, it had shaken him to his core. "The skull was in my uncle's study," Pemberton said, "on a shelf, surrounded by other specimens. He had quite a collection of bones, you see. Tibetan and Mongolian, mostly, though he'd acquired pieces from all over Asia. This particular skull was unremarkable at first glance. Human, adult, with some odd markings carved into the cranium. There was a card beneath it, written in my uncle's hand. 'The Oracle of Lhasa speaks truth to those who dare to listen.'" He laughed, a sound without humour. "I thought it was typical Augustus. Always dramatic, always convinced he'd discovered something profound. I left the skull where it was, along with most of his other curiosities. My wife and I moved into the Bloomsbury house. It's far grander than our previous residence, and the neighbourhood is quite respectable. We brought our 2 daughters, Clarissa and Evangeline, 14 and 12, respectively." The mention of children brought a sharper focus to Watson's attention. Holmes, too, leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes intense. "It was perhaps 10 days after we'd settled in," Pemberton continued, "that I first heard it. I'd been working late in the study, my uncle's study, though I suppose it's mine now. Going through his papers, trying to make sense of his accounts. It must have been past midnight. The house was silent, my family all asleep upstairs. And then, a whisper. So faint I thought at first I'd imagined it." He paused, his gaze fixed on something Watson couldn't see, something that existed only in memory and nightmare. "It spoke my name. 'Richard,' it said. Just that. 'Richard.' I looked up from my papers, thinking perhaps my wife had come down, but the room was empty. Just me and the books and all those relics staring down from their shelves. I returned to my work, convinced I'd been on the verge of dozing and had dreamed it. But then it came again. 'Richard Pemberton, I know what you did.' The fire hissed, a log settling deeper into the coals. Outside, the fog had transformed Baker Street into something from a fairy tale, a place where ordinary rules might not apply. I stood up so quickly I knocked over my chair, Pemberton said. "I searched the room, looked behind the curtains, checked the door to ensure no one had opened it. Nothing. No one." And yet the voice continued, growing stronger. "It knew things, Mr. Holmes. Things about my business dealings, about certain liberties I'd taken with my clients' investments. Nothing illegal, you understand, but perhaps not entirely ethical. Things I'd buried deep, things no one could possibly know." Holmes's expression remained neutral, but Watson caught the slight narrowing of his eyes. "The voice specified these matters?" "In excruciating detail. It described a transaction from 3 years ago, named the client involved, quoted the exact sum I'd skimmed from the account before covering it with creative bookkeeping. It told me things about my marriage, about arguments I'd had with my wife that no one had witnessed. It knew about a letter I'd written to a woman in Brighton, a letter I'd burned in the grate of my office. It knew everything, Mr. Holmes. Everything." The brandy glass trembled in his hands, amber liquid catching the firelight. "I fled the study that first night, convinced myself in the harsh light of morning that I'd suffered some sort of episode, brought on by stress and the unsettling nature of my uncle's collection. But the next night, and the night after, it happened again. Always past midnight, always when I was alone in that room, and I began to notice something. The whispers seemed to emanate from the area where the skulls were shelved, from that one skull in particular, with its carved markings and its presumptuous label." Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace, his movements fluid and thoughtful. The room had grown darker as the evening deepened, the fire providing most of the light now, casting long shadows that moved in rhythm with his steps. "Did you attempt to remove the skull?" he asked. "Not at first. I thought I was going mad. You see. What rational man blames his troubles on a skull? But after a week of sleepless nights and whispers that followed me even into my dreams, I ordered my butler to move it, to take it to the cellar, to destroy it if necessary. But before he could carry out my instructions, something happened that changed everything." Pemberton set down his brandy glass and leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper itself. "A letter arrived. Anonymous, of course. It detailed the same indiscretions the skull had whispered about, and it demanded payment, a substantial sum, to ensure these secrets remained secret. It threatened exposure, ruin, scandal. My career destroyed, my family's reputation shattered, all because of things the skull had spoken of in the dark." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This was no longer merely a tale of supernatural superstition. This was blackmail, criminal and calculated. "How much did they demand?" Holmes asked, his voice sharp now, all pretense of casual inquiry abandoned. £5,000, to be delivered to an address in Whitechapel within the week. If I refused, or if I went to the police, the letters would be sent to my competitors, to the financial papers, to everyone who might take pleasure in my downfall. Pemberton's voice cracked slightly. "I have the money, Mr. Holmes. The inheritance from my uncle ensures that. But paying seems only to invite more demands. And yet, if I don't pay—" "You've told no one else about this?" Holmes asked. "My wife knows something troubles me, but not the specifics. I couldn't bear to tell her about my indiscretions." And the blackmailer's letter was explicit, involved the authorities, and everything would be revealed immediately. Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face Pemberton directly. "But you've come to me. You're not the police. And I've heard stories, Mr. Holmes, of your discretion, of cases solved without scandal, of justice served without destruction. I'm desperate. These past weeks have been unbearable. The whispers continue every night I spend in that house, always revealing new secrets, new shameful moments I'd thought forgotten. And I live in constant fear of another letter, another demand. I need to know how they're doing this. I need it to stop. The room fell silent, save for the steady rhythm of the fire. Watson watched his friend's face, seeing the familiar signs of mental gears turning, of that remarkable mind sorting through possibilities and probabilities with the speed and precision of one of Mr. Babbage's calculating engines. "You'll help me?" Pemberton asked. The question weighted with all the hope and fear a desperate man could muster. Holmes was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Then he stirred, seeming to come to some internal decision. "I will investigate, Mr. Pemberton. But I must be clear. If I discover evidence of crimes beyond the blackmail itself, I cannot promise to keep it from the proper authorities. However, I have always believed that the pursuit of truth need not automatically result in the destruction of reputations, particularly when the greater crime lies elsewhere." The relief that washed over Pemberton's features was almost painful to witness. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Thank you. When can you come to the house? When can you examine this cursed skull and tell me how they're using it against me?" "Tomorrow evening," Holmes said decisively. "I shall need to make certain arrangements first, and daylight observations often reveal what darkness conceals. Expect Dr. Watson and myself at 8 o'clock. In the meantime, I want you to do several things. First, do not enter that study alone after dark. Second, make note of any sounds, any disturbances, anything unusual that occurs within the house. Third, and this is crucial, pay attention to who has access to your home: servants, tradesmen, visitors, anyone who might have opportunity to move freely through your rooms." Pemberton nodded, absorbing these instructions with the eagerness of a man given concrete actions after weeks of helpless confusion. "I'll do exactly as you say. The address is 47 Montague Place, just off Russell Square. You can't miss it. It's the one with the rather excessive amount of statuary in the garden. My uncle's taste extended to the exterior as well." He rose from his chair, steadier now than when he'd arrived, as though merely speaking his troubles aloud had lifted some portion of their weight. Watson showed him to the door, noting the way the fog swallowed him almost immediately once he stepped outside, his footsteps fading like a ghost's into the November night. When Watson returned to the sitting-room, he found Holmes standing at the window once more, pipe in hand, his profile thoughtful against the dim glow from the street. "What do you make of it?" Watson asked. Holmes turned, and there was something in his expression that might have been satisfaction, might have been anticipation. "I make of it, my dear Watson, that we are not dealing with the supernatural, but with something far more dangerous, human ingenuity applied to criminal purposes. Someone has found a way to make a skull appear to whisper secrets. Someone is using that illusion to extract money from frightened men. And someone," he added, his voice dropping to a tone that suggested the game was very much afoot, "is about to discover that their clever scheme has attracted the attention of someone rather more difficult to fool than their previous victims." He returned to his chair, reaching for his notebook. "We have much to prepare before tomorrow evening. I'll need to review what little literature exists on acoustic phenomena and bone resonance. And I believe a visit to the British Museum's anthropology collection might prove enlightening. If this skull truly came from Lhasa, there may be others like it, and understanding its construction could prove essential. Watson settled back into his own chair, feeling that familiar thrill that always accompanied the beginning of a new case. Outside, London whispered on through its fog, a city of 4 million souls, each carrying their own secrets, their own fears. And somewhere in Bloomsbury, in a house filled with relics and mysteries, a skull waited in the darkness, ready to whisper truths that might destroy a man. But Sherlock Holmes had never been particularly impressed by whispers in the dark. He preferred, as he often said, the harsh light of reason. And tomorrow that light would shine on 47 Montague Place, illuminating whatever shadows had been carefully constructed there. The fire burned lower, and the night deepened, and 2 men sat in comfortable silence, preparing for the mystery that awaited them, with the patience of those who knew that every puzzle, no matter how intricate, eventually revealed its solution to those determined enough to seek it. The following evening arrived, wrapped in the same grey fog that seemed to be London's preferred attire that November. Watson and Holmes made their way through streets that gleamed wetly under the gaslight, their footsteps echoing off cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of secrets. The cab that carried them swayed gently as it navigated the familiar route from Baker Street to Bloomsbury, that peculiar neighbourhood where intellectual pursuits and old money maintained an uneasy but generally cordial relationship. Montague Place revealed itself gradually through the mist, a respectable street lined with tall Georgian houses that stood shoulder to shoulder like proper gentlemen at a club, each maintaining its dignity while quietly observing its neighbours. Number 47 announced itself exactly as Pemberton had promised. The front garden was populated with an almost alarming variety of stone figures. Buddha sat serenely beside what appeared to be a Mongolian warrior, a multi-armed deity that Watson recognized vaguely as Hindu, kept company with a series of smaller sculptures whose origin he couldn't begin to guess. It was as though Augustus Pemberton had attempted to recreate the world's spiritual pantheon in his front garden, and the effect was simultaneously impressive and slightly unsettling. Our late collector certainly wasn't concerned with neighbourhood aesthetics, Holmes murmured as they approached the front door. Though I suspect his neighbours found the eccentricity more tolerable than they might have otherwise, given the evident expense involved. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a butler whose bearing suggested he had served in military capacity before entering domestic service. His posture was impeccable, his expression carefully neutral, but Watson caught the slight tightness around his eyes that suggested the household's recent troubles had not escaped the servant's notice. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," the butler said, his voice carrying the measured tones of a man who had learned to speak softly in a house full of echoes. "Mr. Pemberton is expecting you. If you'll follow me, please." The interior of the house fulfilled the promise made by its garden. Every available surface seemed occupied by some artifact or curiosity. Masks from a dozen different cultures gazed down from the walls with hollow eyes. Display cases lined the hallway, filled with pottery and jewellery, small statues and carved tablets whose purposes Watson could only imagine. The air carried a scent that was difficult to define: old paper and incense, dust and something else, something faintly medicinal that might have been the preservation oils used on ancient objects. "It's like walking through the British Museum after hours," Watson whispered to Holmes as they followed the butler up a staircase whose banister had been carved to resemble serpents. "Indeed," Holmes replied, his sharp eyes cataloguing everything they passed. Though museums generally organize their collections with some attention to geography or chronology, our late collector seems to have arranged things according to some personal logic that escapes immediate comprehension. Note how the Tibetan prayer wheels sit beside what appear to be Egyptian canopic jars. And that tapestry, unless I'm very much mistaken, that's Persian work from the Safavid period. Yet it hangs next to African ceremonial spears. Augustus Pemberton collected without discrimination, it seems, quantity over curation. They were led to a drawing room on the first floor, where Richard Pemberton waited, along with a woman Watson immediately recognized as his wife. She was perhaps 40, elegant in that particular way that suggested both good breeding and careful attention to propriety. Her dress was fashionable, but not ostentatious, her posture perfect, her hands folded calmly in her lap. But her eyes, when they met Watson's, carried the same worry that haunted her husband's face. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Pemberton said, rising to greet them with considerably more energy than he'd possessed the previous evening. Hope, Watson reflected, was a remarkable tonic. "May I present my wife, Eleanor? My dear, these are the gentlemen I told you about." Mrs. Pemberton inclined her head graciously. "I'm very grateful you've come. Richard has been... That is, we've all been quite unsettled by recent events. I confess I don't fully understand what's happening, but I know my husband is suffering, and that's quite enough for me." "Your husband has been wise to seek assistance," Holmes said, settling into a chair that, like everything else in the house, appeared to have originated somewhere east of Constantinople. "Mrs. Pemberton, I wonder if I might ask, have you yourself experienced anything unusual in this house? Any unexplained sounds? Any sense of presence, shall we say?" She considered the question carefully, her brow furrowing slightly. "I'm not a fanciful woman, Mr. Holmes. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits, or any of that spiritualist nonsense that's become so fashionable. But I'll admit that this house has an atmosphere. One feels constantly observed, though whether that's due to all these artifacts staring from their shelves or something else, I couldn't say. As for sounds, well, old houses make noises, floorboards settle, pipes groan. I've heard nothing I couldn't attribute to natural causes." "But you haven't spent time alone in the study after dark," Holmes observed. It wasn't quite a question. "No," she admitted. "That's been Richard's domain. He's been working there most evenings, sorting through Augustus's papers. Though lately," she glanced at her husband, "lately he's been finding reasons to avoid it." "For good reason," Pemberton said, a slight defensive edge entering his voice. "Eleanor doesn't know everything, Mr. Holmes. I've spared her certain details. But the whispers are real, and they're deeply disturbing. I haven't imagined them." "I don't for a moment suggest that you have," Holmes said smoothly. "The human ear is a remarkably sensitive instrument, capable of detecting sounds at the very threshold of audibility. Whether those sounds originate from the source you believe, however, remains to be determined. Shall we examine this study of yours?" Pemberton led them back into the hallway and down a corridor lined with more masks. These ones appeared to be ceremonial, their expressions frozen in eternal grimaces or ecstatic grins. The study door was heavy oak, its surface carved with symbols that Watson recognized as Sanskrit, though he couldn't have translated them if his life depended on it. The room beyond was exactly what one might expect from a man who had spent his life accumulating the arcane and unusual. It was large, with high ceilings and tall windows that currently showed nothing but the fog pressing against the glass like a curious phantom. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, sagging under the weight of volumes in languages Watson couldn't identify. The 4th wall was given over entirely to display cases and shelves, upon which rested the bone collection. There were perhaps 30 skulls visible from where Watson stood, along with other skeletal elements, femurs and vertebrae, finger bones arranged in careful patterns, a complete skeleton of what might have been a child, mounted in a glass case with a brass plate that identified it in Latin terms Watson's medical training allowed him to partially decipher. The collection was impressive in its morbidity, a reminder that death was the great collector's ultimate prize. But it was the skull on the middle shelf that drew the eye. It sat slightly apart from its companions, elevated on a small wooden stand that raised it to approximately eye level for a seated man. The bone was yellowed with age, the surface marked with carved symbols that wound around the cranium in intricate spirals. The empty eye sockets seemed to watch the room with the patience of something that had outlasted empires and would outlast anything living within these walls. Holmes approached it with the careful, focused attention he might give to a crime scene. He didn't touch it immediately, but, instead, studied it from multiple angles, his eyes moving over every detail with that peculiar intensity that suggested he wasn't merely looking, but truly seeing. "The Oracle of Larsa," he murmured, reading the card beneath it, "speaks truth to those who dare to listen. Your uncle had a gift for the dramatic, Mr. Pemberton." "He believed it was genuine," Pemberton said from near the doorway. Watson noted that he seemed reluctant to enter the room fully, hovering on its threshold like a man standing at the edge of a precipice. He wrote in his journal that he'd acquired it from a monastery that was being abandoned due to the skull's reputation. Apparently, several monks had gone mad after spending time in its presence. "How very convenient," Holmes said dryly. "Provenance through catastrophe is always difficult to verify." "Watson, your medical opinion. What can you tell me about this specimen?" Watson moved closer, his physician's training overriding any superstitious unease. He'd worked with cadavers throughout his medical education, had seen death in all its forms during his military service in Afghanistan. A skull, regardless of what myths had been attached to it, was simply bone and calcium, the remnant of a life once lived. "Adult male," he said after a moment's examination. The bone density and the degree of fusion in the cranial sutures suggest someone in their 5th or 6th decade at time of death. The teeth, what remain of them, show significant wear, consistent with a diet that included a lot of grain grinding. The carvings appear to have been made post-mortem, given the way they've weathered differently than the bone itself. As for origin, he peered closer. The cranial structure is consistent with Asian populations, which supports the Tibetan claim, though that's hardly conclusive. Holmes nodded, producing a magnifying glass from his pocket. He leaned in close, examining the carved symbols with minute attention. "Fascinating," he murmured. "These markings follow a pattern, but not one I recognize from my admittedly limited knowledge of Tibetan religious iconography. They might be authentic, or they might be the invention of someone wishing to make an unremarkable skull appear more mysterious. The wear suggests the latter. The grooves are too uniform, too fresh, given the apparent age of the bone itself. He reached out, and, before Pemberton could protest, lifted the skull carefully from its stand. It was a testament to Holmes's powers of observation that he immediately paused, his expression shifting to one of intense interest. "It's lighter than it should be," he said. "Watson, what would you estimate the weight of a human skull to be?" "Between 2 and 3 pounds, generally. Varies with size and bone density, of course. This weighs perhaps half that." Holmes turned the skull over in his hands, examining it from every angle. The firelight from the hearth, for a fire had been lit in preparation for their visit, cast dancing shadows across the bone's surface, making the carved symbols seem to writhe and shift. Then Holmes did something that made both Watson and Pemberton inhale sharply. He brought the skull close to his ear and shook it gently, like a child testing a wrapped present to guess its contents. There was a sound, faint but unmistakable, a soft rattling, something loose within the cranial cavity. "Well," Holmes said, his voice carrying that particular note of satisfaction that accompanied a confirmed hypothesis, "that's very interesting indeed." "What is?" Pemberton asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "What did you hear?" "Evidence of modification," Holmes replied. "This skull is not quite what it appears to be. The cavity has been altered. Something has been placed inside. And that, Mr. Pemberton, begins to explain a great deal." He set the skull down carefully and began to examine the area where it had rested. The wooden stand was simple but well crafted, with a circular depression that cradled the skull's base. Holmes ran his fingers along its surface, then beneath it, his expression growing more thoughtful. "The stand is newer than the skull," he observed. "Made within the last decade, I'd estimate, and by someone with considerable woodworking skill. Note the joints, dovetailed and seamless. And here." His fingers probed beneath the stand's base. "There's a small cavity here as well, deliberately carved, I think, to precise dimensions." "What does it mean?" Watson asked, leaning in to see what Holmes had discovered. "It means," Holmes said, straightening and dusting off his hands, "that we are dealing with something considerably more sophisticated than a simple object of superstition. This skull has been carefully prepared, modified to serve a specific purpose. And its position in this room, the placement of the stand, the relationship to the rest of the furniture, all of it has been arranged with considerable thought." He turned to Pemberton, who had finally ventured fully into the room, drawn by curiosity, despite his fear. "Tell me, when you hear the whispers, where are you positioned? Be specific." Pemberton pointed to the desk, which sat perhaps 10 feet from the skull's shelf. "There. I'm usually seated, working on papers. The lamp is lit. I keep it turned low, just enough to read by. And then, after some time, when the house has grown quiet, I begin to hear it. Faint at first, like wind through a crack. Then clearer, more insistent. And the whispers seem to come from the direction of the skull. Yes, unmistakably, as though the thing itself were speaking." Holmes nodded slowly, then moved to the desk and sat in the chair Pemberton had indicated. He arranged himself, as though working, his head bent over imaginary papers, his body angled slightly toward the lamp. He remained that way for a long moment, perfectly still, and Watson found himself holding his breath without quite knowing why. Then Holmes spoke, but his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a whisper that filled the room like smoke. "Richard Pemberton, I know what you did." Watson felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The effect was extraordinary. The voice seemed to emanate not from Holmes's position, but from somewhere else entirely, diffuse and impossible to locate. Pemberton had gone pale. "That's it," he breathed. "That's exactly how it sounds. How did you—" Holmes stood, and when he spoke again, his voice was normal, originating clearly from his own mouth. "Acoustics, Mr. Pemberton. This room has been very carefully arranged to create specific sonic effects. The shape of the ceiling, the placement of the skulls and other hard surfaces, the positioning of the furniture, all of it works together to create an echo chamber of sorts. A whisper from this desk, directed at the proper angle, bounces and reflects until it seems to come from the area where the skull sits." He began to pace, gesturing as he spoke. "But that alone wouldn't account for the specificity of the whispers you've heard. For that, we need to look beyond acoustics to a more direct form of communication. Tell me, have you noticed anyone in the house behaving unusually? Any servants with access to this room who might have reason to—" He stopped mid-sentence, his attention caught by something. Moving quickly to one of the bookshelves, he ran his fingers along its edge, then suddenly pressed against what appeared to be a decorative element of the woodwork. There was a soft click, and a section of the shelf swung inward, revealing a narrow space behind it. "A priest hole," Holmes announced with evident satisfaction. "Common enough in older houses, though usually dating from the period of Catholic persecution. This one, however, appears to be a later addition. Recent, in fact. And, unless I'm very much mistaken—" He leaned into the opening, his voice echoing slightly. "Yes, this space connects to another room, probably the one adjacent. And here, at the back—" He withdrew, holding something small and metallic. A speaking tube, primitive but effective. Someone positioned in the hidden space could whisper through this tube, and their voice would emerge near the skull, amplified by the room's acoustic properties. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Even the fire seemed to pause in its crackling, as though the room itself were absorbing the implications of what Holmes had discovered. "Someone has been hiding in my walls." Pemberton's voice was barely above a whisper, horror and relief mingling in equal measure. "Listening to me, speaking to me through that tube." "More than listening, I suspect," Holmes said, grimly. "They've been gathering information, learning your secrets, then using them against you. The blackmail letter was no coincidence, Mr. Pemberton. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to make you believe in the supernatural, so that when they make their demands, you're too frightened and confused to think clearly." Watson moved to examine the hidden space himself, his mind reeling. The sophistication of it, the careful planning, the psychological manipulation. It spoke of criminal minds far more dangerous than common thieves. "But who?" Pemberton asked, the question hanging in the air like the fog outside. "Who would do this? And how did they gain access to my house, to my uncle's study? This modification must have taken time to accomplish." Holmes replaced the speaking tube carefully and closed the priest hole, his expression thoughtful. "That, Mr. Pemberton, is what we must determine. But I can tell you this much. Whoever orchestrated this scheme had intimate knowledge of your uncle's collection and this house's layout. They knew about the skull, understood its potential for inspiring fear, and they had either legitimate access to this room or were skilled enough to gain it without detection. He turned to face both men, his grey eyes sharp with the thrill of the hunt. We're no longer dealing with whispers and superstition, gentlemen. We're dealing with a calculated criminal conspiracy, and our skull, far from being an oracle, is merely a very clever prop in an elaborate theatrical production designed to separate frightened men from their money. Outside, the fog pressed closer against the windows, and somewhere in the house a clock began to chime the hour. The skull sat on its shelf, silent now, its empty eyes revealing nothing. But its secrets, Holmes had determined, would soon be dragged into the light. The revelation of the speaking tube and the hidden priest hole transformed the atmosphere in the study entirely. What had moments before seemed like a chamber of supernatural dread now revealed itself as a stage, carefully constructed for a performance designed to terrify and manipulate. Yet this understanding brought with it a new kind of unease, the knowledge that human malevolence, not spectral whispers, had invaded Pemberton's home. Holmes stood before the concealed passage, his fingers tracing the edges of the false panel with the delicate attention of a surgeon examining an incision. "The craftsmanship is quite good," he observed, his voice carrying that note of professional appreciation. One expert might accord another, even across the boundary of law and criminality. This wasn't done hastily or by an amateur. Someone with considerable skill in carpentry created this modification, someone who understood the structure of the house well enough to know which wall could be breached without compromising the building's integrity. "My uncle employed workmen constantly," Pemberton said, his earlier fear giving way to a kind of angry bewilderment. He was always having something modified, some new case built for a recent acquisition. The house was like a construction site for years. Anyone might have. That is, there would have been ample opportunity. "Quite so," Holmes agreed, "which broadens our suspect pool considerably. Watson, make a note. We'll need a list of everyone who's worked on this house in the past several years. Carpenters, certainly, but also plasterers, painters, anyone who might have had legitimate reason to be alone in this room for extended periods." Watson withdrew his notebook, but his attention remained fixed on the hidden panel. "Holmes, if someone can access this space from an adjacent room, shouldn't we investigate that room immediately? They might still be—" "An excellent suggestion," Holmes interrupted, already moving toward the door. "Mr. Pemberton, what lies on the other side of this wall?" "A guest bedroom," Pemberton replied, hurrying to keep pace as Holmes strode into the corridor. "We've been using it for storage, mostly. My uncle's papers, items from the collection that I haven't yet catalogued. No one sleeps there." The guest bedroom door was unlocked, which Holmes noted with a slight frown. The room beyond matched Pemberton's description. A once elegant space, now serving as a repository for the overflow of Augustus Pemberton's obsessions. Crates lined the walls, their contents partially visible through gaps in the wooden slats. Scrolls and books were stacked on every available surface. A wardrobe stood in one corner, its doors slightly ajar, to reveal more papers stuffed within. Holmes went directly to the wall that should adjoin the study, running his hands along the faded wallpaper with systematic precision. "Here," he announced after a moment, pressing against a section that looked identical to all the others. Another panel, this one larger, swung inward to reveal the narrow passage he'd discovered from the study side. The space between the walls was perhaps 2 feet wide, enough for a person to stand uncomfortably, to move sideways if necessary, but hardly a comfortable vantage point. Yet someone had spent time here. That much was evident. The dust on the floor had been disturbed, footprints visible in the dim light that filtered through from both openings. And there, set into the wall at approximately shoulder height, was the other end of the speaking tube, cunningly concealed behind what appeared to be ordinary decorative moulding. "Extraordinary," Watson breathed, leaning in to examine the mechanism. The tube must run through the wall cavity, angled to emerge near the skull's position. When someone whispers into this end, the sound travels through and emerges in a room whose acoustic properties have been specifically arranged to amplify and displace the sound, Holmes finished, making it seem as though the skull itself were speaking. Combined with the psychological preparation, the skull's reputation, the late hour, the isolation, it creates a perfect storm of suggestibility. The victim hears whispers that seem impossible, containing information that should be secret, and his rational mind simply surrenders. Pemberton had gone quiet, his face working through emotions Watson recognized from his medical practice, the peculiar mixture of relief and humiliation that comes when one realizes one has been fooled. "I feel like the greatest idiot in London," he said finally. "To have been taken in by such a trick, to have believed that a skull could actually—" "Don't," Holmes said sharply, turning to face him. "Whoever orchestrated this is no common criminal. They're a student of human psychology, a skilled craftsman, and a patient planner. They chose their victim carefully, researched your vulnerabilities, created an elaborate mechanism to exploit them. There's no shame in being deceived by an expert deceiver, Mr. Pemberton. The shame belongs entirely to those who would use such methods for extortion." He returned his attention to the hidden passage, producing a small torch from his pocket, one of the electric ones that had recently become available, compact and surprisingly bright. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing more details. Scratches on the walls where someone had braced themselves. A small ledge, perhaps 6 inches wide, where items might be placed. And something else. Something that made Holmes's expression sharpen with interest. "Watson, look here." He directed the torch beam to a specific spot. "What do you make of this?" Watson peered in, his eyes adjusting to the light. There, caught on a rough edge of wood, was a tiny scrap of fabric. Dark blue or black, he couldn't quite tell in the torchlight, but all definitely fabric, and recently snagged, judging by the way the threads still held their colour. "From a coat or jacket," Watson ventured. "Whoever used this passage wore something that caught on the wood. Indeed, and note the height at which it was caught, approximately 5 feet, 8 inches from the floor. That gives us an approximate height for at least one of our conspirators." Holmes carefully extracted the fabric scrap and placed it in a small envelope he produced from another pocket. "We're building a picture, gentlemen. Slow work, but essential." They returned to the study, Holmes closing the panels behind them with evident satisfaction. He moved to the desk where Pemberton had sat during his nightly ordeals and settled into the chair once more, his eyes moving systematically across the room, taking in angles and distances, lines of sight and acoustic pathways. "Tell me about the blackmail letter," he said. "You mentioned it arrived after you'd experienced several nights of whispers. Describe it in detail. The paper, the handwriting, how it was delivered." Pemberton moved to the desk and withdrew a letter from one of its drawers. His hands trembled slightly as he passed it to Holmes. It came in the Morning Post 3 days after the whispers began. My butler brought it up with the rest of the correspondence. Nothing about the envelope seemed unusual. Standard stationery, my name and address written in block capitals. Holmes examined the envelope first, holding it up to the lamplight, studying the postmark, the quality of the paper. Then he withdrew the letter itself, a single sheet covered in the same block capitals, each letter formed with mechanical precision. "They were careful," he murmured, reading. "No cursive script that might be analyzed for individual characteristics. Block capitals throughout, drawn with a ruler to ensure uniformity. The paper is common enough, available at any stationer's in London. The ink. Watson, your eyes are younger than mine. What do you make of the ink?" Watson accepted the letter, peering at it closely. "It looks standard enough. Black India ink, I'd guess, though there's something odd about some of the letters. The O's and E's look slightly smudged, as if the pen had too much ink on it. Or as if the writer was wearing gloves," Holmes suggested, making it difficult to control the pen with the usual precision. "Another sign of careful planning. They've left us nothing to work with in terms of handwriting analysis." He read the letter aloud, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Mr. Pemberton, the oracle knows your sins. It has whispered them in the darkness, and now others must know them too. Unless you wish your indiscretions made public, your theft from the Morrison account, your liaison with Mrs. Ashworth in Brighton, your fraudulent manipulation of the Devonshire Trust, you will deliver £5,000 to the address below by Friday next. Place the money in a leather satchel and leave it in the crypt of St. Giles Church in Whitechapel at midnight. Come alone, no police. The oracle sees all, Mr. Pemberton. It will know if you betray this instruction." The room fell silent after Holmes finished reading. Even the fire seemed subdued, its crackling reduced to occasional soft pops as the logs settled. "It's all true," Pemberton said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "Everything they mention. The Morrison account. I borrowed from it temporarily to cover a personal investment that went sour. I replaced the funds within a month, and Morrison never knew, but technically it was theft. Mrs. Ashworth was a widow I met at a seaside hotel 2 years ago. We exchanged letters for a time, nothing more, but my wife would be devastated if she knew. And the Devonshire Trust." He paused, swallowing hard. "I manipulated the books to make my performance look better than it was. Again, nothing that harmed the client directly, but if it came to light, my reputation would be destroyed." "How many people knew these things?" Holmes asked, his tone neutral, neither judging nor absolving. "No one," Pemberton said immediately. Then he caught himself. "That is, I thought no one. The Morrison affair. I was alone in my office when I did it. The letters to Mrs. Ashworth, I destroyed them all. The Devonshire Trust manipulation involved my personal ledgers, which I keep locked in my desk at the bank. So how could they possibly—" "That," Holmes interrupted, "is precisely what we must determine. Your office at the bank. Who has access to it?" "My secretary, the cleaning staff, the senior partners, but they would never—" "Your home office, where you kept correspondence. Here, in this house. My wife sometimes brings me tea when I'm working, but she doesn't read my papers. The servants come in to clean, but only when I'm present." Holmes rose and began to pace, his movements suggesting intense mental activity. "You're thinking about this wrong, Mr. Pemberton. Stop considering who could have accessed these things directly. Instead, consider who might have had opportunity to observe you, to overhear conversations, to piece together information from multiple sources over an extended period." He stopped at the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street below. A lamplighter was making his rounds, his ladder and pole silhouetted against the gaslight like some Victorian spirit of illumination battling the darkness. "Blackmailers are often closer than we think," Holmes continued. "They're servants who listen at doors, clerks who read correspondence left on desks, acquaintances who note which hotels one visits and which widows one takes tea with. They're patient, methodical, and they understand that information is valuable. This group, for I'm convinced we're dealing with more than one person, has been gathering intelligence about you for months, possibly years. They knew your uncle would die and leave you this house. They knew about the skull and its potential to inspire fear. They prepared this elaborate mechanism in advance, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. "You're suggesting this was planned before Augustus Pemberton even died? That they've been preparing this for... possibly from the moment Augustus acquired the skull and began spreading rumors about its supernatural properties. Our criminals are playing a long game, Watson. They've invested significant time and resources into this scheme, which suggests they believe the potential return is worth it. £5,000 from one victim, certainly. But I suspect Mr. Pemberton is not their only target." This observation struck like a thunderclap. Pemberton's face drained of what little colour it had regained. "You think there are others? Other men being blackmailed through this same method?" "I'd wager my reputation on it," Holmes said. "The sophistication of the mechanism, the careful planning, the psychological manipulation, all of it speaks to a criminal enterprise, not a single opportunistic crime. They've created a system, Mr. Pemberton, and systems are designed to be repeatable." He turned from the window, his expression grave. "Watson, do you recall what I mentioned yesterday? That multiple men of good standing had reportedly been driven to distraction by whispers from skulls. We assumed these were separate incidents, perhaps even exaggerations spread by gossip. But what if they're all connected? What if our blackmailers have been using this method across London, targeting wealthy men with secrets to hide?" Watson's mind raced through the implications. "Good God, Holmes, if you're right, this could be the largest blackmail conspiracy London has seen in decades." "Which explains why they've been so careful," Holmes agreed. "They're not common criminals content with a single score. They're building an empire of fear and extortion, using the veneer of the supernatural to paralyze their victims into compliance. And they've chosen their marks brilliantly. Men who can afford the payments. Men with reputations that make exposure devastating. Men who would rather pay than face public scandal." He began to pace again, his energy barely contained. "Mr. Pemberton, I need you to think very carefully. In the weeks before your uncle died, or immediately after, did anyone show particular interest in his collection? Did anyone ask about the skulls specifically? Dealers, perhaps, or fellow collectors? Museum representatives?" Pemberton's brow furrowed in concentration. "There was a man," he said slowly, "a dealer in antiquities, or so he claimed. He came to the house perhaps a month after Uncle Augustus's death, said he'd heard about the collection, wondered if I might be interested in selling certain pieces. I told him I wasn't ready to make such decisions yet, that I was still cataloguing everything. Did he examine the skull? He looked at everything, spent hours going through the collection, taking notes. He seemed particularly interested in the bones, actually. Said there was a growing market for authentic Tibetan ritual objects. He left his card. Pemberton moved to the desk again, rifling through a drawer. Here, Erasmus Blake, dealer in Oriental curiosities. An address in Clerkenwell. Holmes accepted the card with evident interest, studying it closely. Clerkenwell, a neighbourhood known for its workshops and skilled craftsmen. How very interesting. Did Mr. Blake come alone? He had an assistant with him, a younger man who carried his case and took notes. I didn't catch his name. Can you describe them both? Blake was perhaps 50, portly, with mutton chop whiskers going grey. Spoke with an educated accent, seemed knowledgeable about Asian artifacts. The assistant was younger, maybe 30, thin, dark hair. Quiet sort. Didn't say much, just followed Blake around with his notebook. Holmes was already moving toward the door. Watson, we're leaving. Mr. Pemberton, I want you to follow my earlier instructions precisely. Do not enter this study alone after dark. Keep the servants away from the guest bedroom. And above all, pay the blackmail demand. What? Pemberton looked stunned. But you've discovered their method. Surely now we can. We can do nothing that alerts them to our investigation, Holmes said firmly. If you refuse to pay, if they suspect I'm involved, they'll simply disappear and begin again elsewhere with different victims. No, we need them to believe their scheme is working perfectly. Pay the money. Go to St. Giles Church on Friday at midnight, as instructed. Leave the satchel in the crypt. Watson and I will be watching, and when they collect their prize, we'll follow them back to their lair. Understanding dawned on Pemberton's face. You want to catch them in the act. I want to catch them, expose their entire operation, and ensure they can never victimize anyone else. But that requires patience, Mr. Pemberton. Can you manage it? Can you play the frightened victim for a few more days while we lay our trap? Pemberton straightened, some of his dignity returning. Yes, by God, I can. If it means stopping these villains, I'll play whatever part you need. Excellent. Holmes retrieved his coat from where he'd left it. We'll be in touch before Friday with specific instructions. In the meantime, continue your normal routine. Appear troubled, worried. Let the servants gossip about your distress. We want the blackmailers confident, not suspicious. As they descended the stairs and made their way through the artifact-lined corridors, Watson leaned close to his friend. Do you really think this Blake fellow is involved? I think, Holmes replied quietly, that a man who deals in curiosities would know exactly what use could be made of a whispering skull, and a man who employs assistants might have access to skilled craftsmen capable of creating hidden passages and speaking tubes. But speculation is premature, Watson. We need evidence. They emerged into the fog-wrapped street, London's eternal grey blanket settling around them like a familiar embrace. Somewhere in this vast city, criminals plotted and schemed, using fear as their weapon and secrets as their currency. But Sherlock Holmes was on their trail now, and the fog that concealed them would soon give way to the harsh light of exposure. The game, as Holmes would say, was most decidedly afoot. The following morning found Holmes in a state of focused intensity that Watson had learned to recognize as the prelude to breakthrough. He had risen before dawn, and when Watson emerged from his bedroom at a more civilized hour, he discovered his friend surrounded by books, papers, and what appeared to be several mechanical components whose purpose Watson couldn't immediately discern. "Ah, Watson," Holmes greeted him without looking up from the brass tube he was examining. "Good morning. I trust you slept well? I've been conducting experiments." Watson poured himself tea from the pot Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully left warming by the fire. The November morning pressed grey and damp against the windows, but inside Baker Street the lamps glowed cheerfully, and the fire crackled with domestic contentment. Experiments involving what appears to be half the contents of a plumber's workshop? "Acoustic phenomena," Holmes replied, finally setting down the tube and reaching for his own teacup, which had gone cold hours ago, but which he drank anyway, with apparent indifference. "I've been testing the principles of sound amplification through hollow tubes, the resonance properties of various materials, and the ways in which bone, specifically cranial bone, might be utilized to enhance these effects." He gestured to a skull that sat on the table beside him, one Watson recognized as belonging to Holmes's own collection of anatomical specimens. "The human skull is a remarkable structure, Watson. The cranial cavity, when properly utilized, can act as a resonance chamber, not unlike the body of a violin. Sound introduced at the correct angle and frequency will bounce within the hollow space, amplifying and taking on qualities that seem almost unearthly." Watson settled into his chair, his medical curiosity piqued despite the early hour. "You're suggesting the blackmailers understood these acoustic properties, that they deliberately chose a skull because of its sonic characteristics?" "I'm suggesting more than that." Holmes rose and retrieved the skull, turning it in his hands with the casual familiarity of one who had spent years studying human anatomy. "I'm suggesting they modified this particular skull to enhance those properties. Observe." He tilted the skull so Watson could see into the hollow interior. In the morning light, certain irregularities became visible. Small holes drilled at precise points, surfaces that had been carefully smoothed or roughened, subtle alterations that would be invisible to a casual observer, but which, once pointed out, seemed almost glaringly obvious. "These modifications," Holmes continued, "would allow sound to enter through the base, where the speaking tube terminates, and then reverberate within the cavity in such a way as to emerge from the eye sockets and nasal aperture with an altered quality. The effect would be profoundly unsettling, not quite human, not quite anything recognizable. A whisper from beyond the grave, as it were." He set the skull down and moved to another part of his makeshift laboratory, where he'd arranged what appeared to be a scale model of a room. But the skull alone isn't sufficient. The entire environment must be carefully orchestrated. Consider Pemberton's study, the ceiling height, the hardness of the walls, the placement of furniture and other objects. All of it affects how sound travels and where it appears to originate. Watson leaned forward, studying the model. Holmes had recreated the study with remarkable accuracy, including tiny representations of the bookshelves, the desk, even miniature skulls arranged on a shelf. "You built this overnight?" "I've had 3 hours of sleep and Mrs. Hudson's excellent coffee. The combination works wonders. Now observe." Holmes produced a small whistle, positioned himself at what would correspond to the hidden passage, and blew a soft note. The sound seemed to travel through the model room, bouncing off the miniature walls, and emerged near the shelf of tiny skulls with an eerie, displaced quality. "Remarkable," Watson breathed. "The sound seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once." Precisely the effect our blackmailers desired. The victim sits at the desk, alone in the late evening, his rational defenses lowered by fatigue and isolation. He hears a whisper that seems to emanate from the skull. His mind, already primed by the skull's reputation, by the late hour, by the peculiar atmosphere of the house, accepts the impossible explanation because the alternative, that someone is hiding in his walls, spying on him, manipulating him, is even more disturbing in some ways. Holmes began to pace, his energy barely contained by the confines of the room. "They've weaponized psychology, Watson. Fear is their tool, and they wield it with the precision of a surgeon. First, they establish the skull's reputation, whispers of madness, tales of supernatural power. Then they ensure their victim inherits it, places it in a room they've prepared. They wait for him to settle in, to develop a routine, to let his guard down, and then they begin the whispers." "But how did they learn Pemberton's secrets?" Watson asked. "That's the piece I still can't fathom. Even with access to the house, how could they know about his financial irregularities, his correspondence with Mrs. Ashworth?" "That," Holmes said, his expression growing darker, "is what we discovered at 3 o'clock this morning. Or rather, what I strongly suspect, pending confirmation." He moved to his desk and retrieved a newspaper, already folded to a specific page. The Times from 4 days ago, read the social notices. Watson scanned the page, finding nothing immediately relevant, until Holmes's finger directed him to a small announcement. "The Spiritualist Society of London announces evening séances, Tuesdays and Thursdays, Mrs. Helena Mordaunt presiding. Private consultations available for matters of a delicate nature." "I don't understand," Watson said. "What does this have to do with—" "Mrs. Mordaunt," Holmes interrupted, "is one of London's most successful mediums. She's been operating for 5 years, building a clientele among the wealthy and anxious. Her specialty is contacting the dead, naturally, but she also offers something else, spiritual counseling for troubled souls. Men come to her, Watson. Men with guilty consciences, men with secrets weighing on them, men who seek absolution or guidance." Understanding began to dawn. "You think Pemberton consulted her? That he told her things in confidence?" "I think it's very likely that men in Pemberton's position, educated, rational, but burdened with guilt, might turn to such sources when traditional religion fails to provide comfort. The spiritualist movement has made such consultations fashionable, almost respectable. And what better way to gather compromising information than to have victims volunteer it willingly, believing they're speaking to the spirits of the dead rather than to a very earthly confederate?" Holmes returned to his chair, steepling his fingers in that characteristic gesture. "Consider the pattern. Mrs. Mordaunt identifies men with secrets through her séances. She passes this information to her accomplices, perhaps our Mr. Blake and his assistant. They arrange for these men to acquire cursed objects from Uncle Augustus's collection, objects they've already prepared for their purpose. The victims are then subjected to weeks of psychological torment before the blackmail demand arrives. It's elegant, systematic, and highly profitable." "But you can't know for certain that Pemberton consulted this medium," Watson protested. "No," Holmes admitted. which is why we're going to ask him. After breakfast, we'll pay another visit to Montague Place. But first, I want to show you something else." He retrieved a thick volume from his bookshelf, one Watson recognized as a treatise on Victorian architecture and building techniques. Holmes opened it to a marked page showing detailed diagrams of wall construction, priest holes, and hidden passages. These concealed spaces were common in houses built during the period of Catholic persecution, Holmes explained. But they fell out of fashion by the late 18th century. The Bloomsbury house where Pemberton now resides was built in 1820, well after such features were necessary or desirable. Yet it contains at least one such passage, recently constructed and carefully concealed. He traced a diagram with his finger. To create such a modification requires extensive knowledge of the house's structure. One must know where the load-bearing walls are, how the joists run, where pipes and chimneys limit available space. This isn't something an amateur could accomplish. It requires a skilled carpenter, someone who either built the original house or has studied its construction intimately. "You're suggesting we should investigate the house's building records?" "Already done. I sent a messenger to the county records office the moment they opened this morning. The house was built by a firm called Ashworth and Sons, which has since dissolved. But I did discover something interesting. Augustus Pemberton commissioned extensive renovations in 1888, just 5 years ago. The firm he employed was Mordaunt Brothers, specialists in fine woodwork and custom cabinetry. Watson felt his pulse quicken. Mordaunt, the same name as the spiritualist medium. "Quite possibly a coincidence," Holmes said, though his expression suggested he believed no such thing. "Or quite possibly evidence of a family enterprise. The Mordaunt brothers, Helena's husband and brother-in-law perhaps, had legitimate access to the house for months. They could have created the hidden passages then, preparing for a scheme they wouldn't implement until years later, after Augustus died and his collection passed to more vulnerable hands." The implications were staggering. Watson rose and moved to the window, watching early morning London emerge from its fog like a city rising from the sea. Carriages rattled past, newsboys called their headlines. The great machine of the metropolis ground into motion for another day. Somewhere in this vast sprawl, criminals plotted with patience and sophistication that rivaled any legitimate enterprise. "If you're right," Watson said slowly, "then this conspiracy goes back years. They've been planning this since before Augustus Pemberton even died. Possibly even before he acquired the skull," Holmes agreed. "Consider, Blake deals in antiquities. He hears of a collector returning from Tibet with a skull said to whisper prophecies. He recognizes the potential immediately. Perhaps he even sold the skull to Augustus, complete with fabricated provenance and supernatural legends. He ensures the rumors spread, building the skull's reputation. Meanwhile, his associates, the Mordaunt brothers, gain access to Augustus's house through legitimate business. They create the necessary modifications. Then they wait." Holmes's voice grew quieter, more intense. "They wait for Augustus to die, for the house and collection to pass to someone less eccentric, more vulnerable. They gather information through the spiritualist seances. And when everything is in place, when they've identified the perfect victim with the perfect secrets, they spring their trap. The skull whispers, the victim panics, the blackmail demand arrives. And because the victim is too ashamed to go to the police, too frightened to think clearly, he pays, and pays, and pays." "But why the elaborate mechanism?" Watson asked. Why not simply send anonymous blackmail letters based on information gathered at séances? Why create the Whispering Skull at all? Because fear paralyzes, Watson. A simple blackmail letter can be resisted, investigated, taken to the authorities. But a man who believes he's being tormented by supernatural forces, who hears his darkest secrets whispered in the dead of night, by a skull that should be silent, that man loses the capacity for rational resistance. He becomes convinced that no escape is possible, that these forces know everything, see everything. He pays not just to protect his reputation, but because he's been psychologically broken. Holmes stood and began gathering his coat and hat. Now come, we have a busy day ahead. First, we confirm whether Pemberton attended Mrs. Mordaunt's séances. Then, we investigate Blake's shop in Clerkenwell. And tonight, we conduct our own séance of sorts. We'll visit St. Giles Church before Fridays. Exchange, scout the location, determine the best positions for surveillance. Watson collected his own coat, his mind still reeling from the scope of the conspiracy Holmes had outlined. And if you're wrong, if this is all speculation built on coincidental names and architectural features, then we'll have wasted a day's investigation, Holmes replied with a slight smile. But I'm not wrong, Watson. The pieces fit too perfectly. The Mordaunt family, medium, carpenters, perhaps Blake as well, under an assumed name, have created a machine for generating profit from fear. They've turned the supernatural into a business model, one that preys on the guilty and the anxious. They descended the stairs to find a cab waiting, Holmes having anticipated their need with his usual prescience. As they settled into the hansom, Watson watched his friend's profile against the grey morning light. There was something almost predatory in Holmes's expression, the look of a hunter who has finally caught his quarry's scent. There's something deeply disturbing about this case, Watson ventured, the psychological cruelty of it. They're not just stealing money, they're tormenting their victims for weeks, driving them to the brink of madness. Indeed, Holmes agreed quietly, which is why we must stop them, Watson, not just for Pemberton's sake, but for all the victims they've already claimed and all those they plan to victimize in the future. This isn't merely crime, it's systematic psychological torture dressed up as supernatural phenomenon. And that, I find, is intolerable. The cab rattled through London's morning streets, carrying them toward Montague Place and the next stage of their investigation. Behind them, in the rooms at Baker Street, the experimental apparatus remained. Tubes and skulls, diagrams and models, the physical evidence of how fear could be manufactured, packaged, and sold to those least equipped to resist it. The fog was lifting, slowly, reluctantly, as London fog always did. By afternoon, if they were fortunate, the sun might even break through. But Holmes and Watson were hunting shadows that dwelt not in the weather, but in the human heart. And those shadows, they knew, would prove far more difficult to dispel. The cab delivered them to Montague Place just as the morning was settling into that peculiar grey light that London wears like a shabby but comfortable coat. The fog had thinned to a mere haze, revealing the street's respectable Georgian facades and the collection of stone deities that marked the Pemberton residence. A maid was sweeping the front steps, her movements mechanical and weary, the posture of someone performing a duty without thought or enthusiasm. Holmes paid the cabby, and they approached the door, which opened before they could knock. The military-bearing butler stood in the entrance, his expression grave. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice lower than the previous evening. "Mr. Pemberton is expecting you, though I should warn you. The master had a difficult night. He's quite distressed this morning." They were led not to the drawing-room, but directly to Pemberton's private study, where they found their client looking considerably worse than he had the evening before. His collar was unfastened, his waistcoat unbuttoned, and his eyes carried the reddened, haunted look of a man who had abandoned any pretense of sleep. A glass of whisky sat on the desk before him, though the morning was barely 2 hours old. "Holmes," he said, his voice rough, "thank God you've come. Last night was worse than ever." Holmes settled into a chair without invitation, his expression sharp with attention. "Tell me exactly what happened." Pemberton ran a hand through his dishevelled hair. "I followed your instructions. I avoided the study after dark, retired to my bedroom at the usual hour. But around 2 in the morning, I woke to find my wife standing at the window, staring out at the garden. When I asked what troubled her, she said she'd heard voices, whispers, coming from the walls themselves." Watson felt a chill run down his spine. "Mrs. Pemberton heard them too. She's convinced the house is haunted. She wants to leave, to take the girls and stay with her sister in Bath until this matter is resolved. I persuaded her to wait a few more days, but, Holmes, if this continues—" He trailed off, taking a long swallow of whisky. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "These whispers your wife heard? Did she make out any words? Any specific messages?" "She said they spoke of death, of secrets buried with the dead, of sins that follow a family through generations." Pemberton's hands trembled as he set down the glass. "It's spreading, Holmes. Whatever curse or mechanism torments me, it's reaching my family now. My daughters asked at breakfast if Grandfather Augustus's ghost walks these halls. They've heard the servants whispering about strange sounds in the night." "Escalation," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to the others. "The blackmailers are increasing pressure. They want you thoroughly terrified by Friday's deadline." He fixed Pemberton with a penetrating stare. "I need you to answer a question with complete honesty, regardless of how it may embarrass you. Have you consulted any spiritualists in recent months? Attended seances? Sought counsel from mediums?" Pemberton's face flushed. How did you—" "Please, Mr. Pemberton, the truth." The man slumped in his chair, all pretense of dignity abandoned. "Yes, I attended 3 séances at Mrs. Mordaunt's establishment in Bloomsbury. This was before my uncle died, when I was struggling with certain business decisions that weighed on my conscience. A colleague suggested that communicating with the spiritual realm might provide clarity." "And during these séances, did you speak of your troubles? The financial irregularities, the correspondence with Mrs. Ashworth?" Yes. Mrs. Mordaunt said the spirits could not help me, unless I was completely honest about my transgressions. She assured me that anything discussed in her parlour was held in strictest confidence, protected by the sacred nature of communication with the beyond. He laughed bitterly. "I was a fool." "You were a man seeking absolution," Holmes corrected, not unkindly, "and they exploited that need with ruthless efficiency. Mrs. Mordaunt passed your confessions to her confederates, who then used them against you. The séances were never about spiritual guidance. They were reconnaissance, gathering intelligence for blackmail." Watson watched understanding and horror dawn on Pemberton's face in equal measure. The spiritualists and the skull. They're all connected. I believe so, yes. We're dealing with an organized conspiracy, Mr. Pemberton, one that spans multiple enterprises and family connections. But we'll discuss the full scope later. For now, I need certain information. Holmes withdrew his notebook. The séances you attended, who else was present? What other gentlemen participated? Pemberton thought for a moment. There were usually 5 or 6 of us. The sessions were advertised as being for gentlemen of conscience seeking higher guidance. Most gave only their first names, maintaining a degree of anonymity. There was a Thomas, a Charles, a Robert. I can't recall all of them clearly. Mrs. Mordaunt kept the lights quite low, and there was incense that made one's head rather foggy. Drugged incense, Holmes said grimly, lowering inhibitions, making participants more suggestible and talkative. Very thorough. Did anyone take notes during these sessions? Mrs. Mordaunt's assistant, a young woman who sat in the corner, she claimed to be recording messages from the spirit world. Recording your confessions, more accurately. Holmes made several notations in his book. And after your uncle died, did you attend any further séances? No. Once I inherited the house and the collection, I became quite busy with the estate. I hadn't thought of Mrs. Mordaunt in weeks until... He paused, making the connection. Until the skull began whispering things I'd told her in confidence. Precisely. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where Augustus Pemberton's statuary stood, like silent witnesses. They gathered your secrets through spiritual theatre, then waited for you to inherit the house they'd already modified. The timing was carefully orchestrated. They couldn't begin their scheme until you were living here, surrounded by your uncle's collection, with the skull positioned in a room they'd prepared for their purposes. Watson had been silent during this exchange, his medical mind working through the psychological manipulation involved. Holmes, if Mrs. Pemberton and the daughters are now hearing whispers, that suggests the blackmailers have expanded their operation. They're no longer content with tormenting Pemberton alone. Quite right, Watson. They're creating a household crisis, ensuring that Pemberton can't simply ignore their demands. When an entire family is affected, when children ask about ghosts and wives threaten to leave, the pressure to resolve the situation becomes overwhelming. Holmes turned back to Pemberton. Which is exactly why we must appear to capitulate completely. You will deliver the money on Friday as instructed. But we will be watching, and we will follow whoever collects it back to the source of this enterprise. And in the meantime, Pemberton asked, how do I endure 3 more days of this? How do I keep my family from fleeing, from spreading word that this house is cursed? Holmes considered for a moment, then made a decision. Tonight, Watson and I will remain here. We'll position ourselves in the hidden passage and in various rooms throughout the house. When the whisperers come, and they will come, we'll be ready to observe their methods. Understanding the mechanism may not stop them immediately, but it will help us anticipate their next moves. You'll stay the night? Relief flooded Pemberton's features. I cannot thank you enough. Perhaps if my wife knows that the great Sherlock Holmes is investigating, she'll find some comfort. Tell her only that we're examining your uncle's collection for historical purposes, Holmes cautioned. The fewer people who know the true nature of our investigation, the better. Our adversaries must believe their scheme is proceeding exactly as planned. They spent the next several hours examining the house more thoroughly than their previous evening's visit had allowed. Holmes measured rooms, tested acoustics, traced the path of the hidden passage through the walls. He discovered that it connected not only the study and guest bedroom, but extended further, with access points to at least 2 other rooms on the first floor. Quite an extensive modification, he observed, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow space between walls. The Mordaunt brothers did thorough work. One could traverse nearly the entire first floor without being seen, emerging in different locations to create the impression of multiple supernatural presences. Watson, who had squeezed into the passage behind him, felt increasingly claustrophobic. The space was dark, musty, and oppressively narrow. How long do you think someone might remain hidden in here? Hours, certainly. Perhaps an entire night if they were sufficiently motivated and compensated. Note these small openings here and here, drilled through to adjacent rooms, allowing observation and listening. And here these hooks set into the wall studs. I'd wager they're for hanging a small lantern, providing just enough light to navigate without being visible from the rooms themselves. They emerged from the passage into the guest bedroom, both grateful for the relative spaciousness of normal architecture. Holmes was covered in dust, cobwebs, his usually immaculate appearance thoroughly compromised, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of confirmed theories. "Tonight," he announced, "Watson will position himself in this room, watching the passage entrance. I'll be in the study itself, concealed behind the heavy curtains near the window. Pemberton will sit at his desk as usual, appearing to work on his uncle's papers. We'll see who comes to whisper in the darkness." The afternoon was spent in preparation. Holmes arranged a series of subtle markers, threads stretched across the passage entrance that would break if someone passed through, dust patterns on the floor that would show footprints, a tiny bell rigged to chime softly if the panel was opened. Mrs. Pemberton was told that the gentlemen were conducting historical research on Augustus's collection and would be working late into the night. She accepted this explanation with weary relief, grateful that someone was taking the situation seriously. Dinner was a subdued affair. The Pemberton daughters, Clarissa and Evangeline, were subdued and watchful, their young faces carrying anxiety beyond their years. They had heard too much, Watson thought, seen too much of their father's distress. Children were sensitive to household tensions, and this household fairly vibrated with suppressed fear. As darkness fell and the fog returned, London fog, reliable as clockwork, the house settled into an uneasy quiet. The servants retired to their quarters. Mrs. Pemberton took the girls upstairs, closing their bedroom doors firmly, as though such barriers might keep supernatural forces at bay. Pemberton settled himself at the study desk, a lamp turned low, papers spread before him that he made no pretense of reading. Watson positioned himself in the guest bedroom, seated in an uncomfortable chair with a clear view of the passage entrance. Holmes had given him a dark lantern, its shutter closed, ready to flood the space with light at the critical moment. The hours crept past with agonizing slowness. 10 o'clock. 11. Midnight chimed from a distant clock tower, the sound muffled by fog and walls. In the study, Holmes remained perfectly still behind his curtain, a shadow among shadows. He had trained himself to maintain absolute immobility for hours when circumstances required it, slowing his breathing, clearing his mind, becoming almost inanimate. Pemberton sat at the desk, occasionally turning a page to maintain the illusion of activity, but his posture was rigid with anticipation. 1 o'clock approached. The house had grown so quiet that Watson could hear his own heartbeat, the soft creak of the building settling, the whisper of the fog against the windows. His eyes were beginning to ache from staring at the unchanging panel when he heard it. The softest possible click, barely audible, the sound of a mechanism being carefully triggered. The panel swung inward, moving so slowly that Watson might have missed it if he hadn't been watching with such focused intensity. A figure slipped through the opening, no more substantial than smoke, moving with practiced silence. Watson's hand tightened on the dark lantern, but Holmes had been explicit. Wait for the whispers to begin. Wait for evidence that could not be disputed. The figure positioned itself in the narrow passage, and Watson could just make out the silhouette raising something to its mouth. A tube, the other end of which terminated near the skull in the adjacent study. There was a pause, a gathering of breath, and then the whispers began. Richard Pemberton. The voice was barely audible, even from Watson's position, but it carried that eerie, displaced quality they'd heard before. The spirits are restless, your sins multiply, your family will pay. In the study, Pemberton went rigid, his face draining of colour. But he maintained his position, as Holmes had instructed. Let them perform their theatre. Let them believe their victim was properly terrified. The whispers continued, elaborating on themes of guilt and retribution, dropping hints about the blackmail demand, ensuring that Pemberton understood the consequences of non-compliance. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The figure began to retreat toward the panel, and Holmes, with timing that would have done credit to a theatrical production, emerged from behind his curtain. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "I believe we have much to discuss." Watson threw open his dark lantern, flooding the guest bedroom with light. The figure in the passage was caught perfectly. A young man, perhaps 30 years old, his expression transforming from concentration to absolute panic in the space of a heartbeat. He lunged for the guest bedroom entrance, but Watson was already moving to block it. "Stay exactly where you are," Holmes commanded, and something in his voice, authority mixed with barely contained fury, froze the intruder in place. "Dr. Watson, if you would be so kind as to ensure our guest doesn't attempt anything foolish." Watson stepped into the passage, positioning himself between the young man and any possible escape route. Up close, he could see the fear in the man's eyes, the desperate calculation of someone weighing impossible odds. "What is your name?" Holmes asked, entering the passage from the study side, effectively trapping the intruder between them. The young man said nothing, his jaw clenched, his body tense as a coiled spring. "Your silence is pointless," Holmes continued. "We know about the Mordaunt family enterprise. We know about Mrs. Mordaunt's seances and the Mordaunt brothers' carpentry work. We know about Blake, the antiquities dealer. The only question remaining is your specific role in this conspiracy. Are you a Mordaunt yourself, an employee, a fellow criminal attracted by the promise of easy profit?" Still silence. But Watson noted the slight tremor that ran through the young man's body, the way his eyes darted from one exit to another, finding no escape. "Very well," Holmes said. "We'll let the police extract that information. Mr. Pemberton, if you would be so kind as to send your butler for a constable, I believe we have our first arrest of the evening, though I suspect he won't be our last." As Pemberton hurried from the room, the young man finally spoke, his voice rough with defeat. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. This is bigger than you know. They'll never let you." "They?" Holmes interrupted sharply. "Tell me about they. Tell me about the full scope of this operation, and perhaps we can discuss leniency with the magistrate." But the young man had said enough. His mouth clamped shut, and his expression hardened into stubborn resistance. He would say nothing more, Watson realized, at least not tonight. But they had him, they had evidence, and most importantly, they had disrupted the blackmailer's careful scheme. The fog pressed against the windows, and somewhere in London other conspirators waited for a report that would never come. The trap had been sprung, and though the full catch remained to be secured, the first threads of the web had been grasped. The long night was far from over, but the game had shifted decisively in their favour. The constable who arrived at Montague Place was a sturdy man named Gregson, younger brother to the Scotland Yard inspector. Holmes had worked with on numerous occasions. He took custody of the prisoner with practised efficiency, though his eyes widened slightly at the sight of the hidden passage and the elaborate mechanism the conspirators had created. "Quite the setup," he observed, peering into the narrow space between walls. "Never seen anything like it. You say they've been using this to convince people the house is haunted?" "Among other purposes," Holmes replied, already moving on to the next phase of their investigation. "The prisoner is to be held without bail, Constable. He's part of a larger conspiracy that we're still unravelling. I'll provide a full statement to your brother at Scotland Yard tomorrow. But, for tonight, simply ensure he speaks to no one and receives no visitors." The young man was led away in handcuffs, his expression sullen, but his silence maintained. Watson watched him go with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. They had caught one conspirator, but how many others remained free? "We can't rest yet," Holmes said, as though reading Watson's thoughts. "Friday is tomorrow night, and the blackmail exchange is still scheduled. Our prisoner's absence will be noticed when he fails to report back to his confederates, which means they'll know their scheme has been compromised. We must move quickly." Pemberton, who had been pacing the study in an agitated state since the arrest, turned to them with desperate hope. "Does this mean it's over? That my family is safe?" "It means," Holmes said carefully, "that we've disrupted their immediate plans. But the conspiracy extends beyond one hired whisper man. We still need to identify and apprehend the masterminds behind this operation, which brings me to our next move." He consulted his pocket watch. 3:00 in the morning. Too late to visit Mrs. Mordaunt's establishment tonight, but first thing tomorrow, today rather, we'll pay her a call. Watson, you should get some rest. We have a long day ahead." But Watson found himself too energized by the night's events to contemplate sleep. Instead, he and Holmes returned to Baker Street as dawn was beginning to grey the eastern sky, the fog slowly surrendering to the pale light of a November morning. Mrs. Hudson, accustomed to their irregular hours, had left fresh coffee warming by the fire, and they settled into their familiar chairs with the grateful exhaustion of soldiers after a successful skirmish. "Tell me your thoughts," Watson said, pouring coffee for them both. "We've captured one operative, but the larger structure remains intact." Holmes accepted the cup and stared into the fire, his sharp features softened slightly by fatigue and flickering light. "I believe we're dealing with three principal actors," he said slowly. "Mrs. Helena Mordaunt, who runs the spiritualist seances and gathers intelligence from guilty men seeking absolution. The Mordaunt brothers, her husband and brother-in-law, most likely, who modified the Pemberton house and created the physical mechanisms. And Erasmus Blake, the antiquities dealer, who provides the cursed objects and the scholarly veneer that makes the whole scheme plausible." "A family business," Watson murmured. "The most dangerous kind. Family members are loyal, less likely to betray one another, more willing to take risks for collective benefit. And this particular family has combined their individual talents into a remarkably efficient criminal enterprise." Holmes set down his cup and reached for his pipe, the ritual of filling and lighting it, providing a moment of contemplation. "Consider the elegance of their system," he continued, smoke wreathing his words. "Mrs. Mordaunt identifies victims, wealthy men with guilty consciences and secrets worth protecting. Her carpenter relatives gain legitimate access to the victims' homes, either through direct employment or by orchestrating situations where their targets acquire property they've already modified. Blake provides the cursed artifacts, complete with fabricated histories that prime the victims for psychological manipulation. Then they execute the scheme, driving their targets to the brink of madness before making their blackmail demands. And if a victim refuses to pay, then they escalate, as we saw last night with Mrs. Pemberton and the daughters. They increase the psychological pressure until compliance becomes the only bearable option. Or," Holmes paused, his expression darkening, "or they carry out their threats, exposing the victim's secrets and ruining them utterly. A few such examples would ensure that most future victims pay promptly." Watson felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. "How many men do you think they've victimized?" "Dozens, possibly. The modifications to the Pemberton house were completed 5 years ago, suggesting they've been operational since at least 1888. If they target 1 or 2 men per year, extract £5,000 from each. We're looking at a criminal enterprise that's generated £50,000 or more. A fortune. And all of it untraceable, unprosecutable, because the victims are too ashamed to come forward. Precisely. The perfect crime, Watson. One where the victims themselves ensure that no investigation occurs." Holmes drew on his pipe, his eyes distant. "Until now. Until they targeted a man who happened to have a colleague who mentioned the case to a doctor who mentioned it to a detective." The morning light was strengthening now, transforming the grey fog into something almost golden as it filtered through London's perpetual haze. The city was waking, the first rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones announcing another day of commerce and industry. But for Holmes and Watson, the night's work was not yet complete. At 9 o'clock, having managed perhaps 2 hours of sleep in their respective chairs, they roused themselves and set out for Bloomsbury. Mrs. Mordaunt's establishment occupied the ground floor of a respectable townhouse on a quiet street where the neighbours minded their own business and asked few questions. A brass plaque beside the door announced, "Mrs. Helena Mordaunt, spiritual counsellor, by appointment." Holmes knocked firmly, and the door was opened by a young woman whose expression suggested she'd been expecting someone else. "We're closed," she said quickly. "Mrs. Mordaunt doesn't receive visitors without—" "I believe she'll make an exception," Holmes interrupted, producing a card. Please inform her that Sherlock Holmes wishes to discuss matters of mutual interest regarding recent events at a certain house in Montague Place." The colour drained from the young woman's face. She took the card with trembling fingers and disappeared into the interior of the house, leaving Holmes and Watson standing in the entrance hall. The space was decorated in the style favoured by spiritualists: heavy curtains, dim lighting, symbolic imagery that mixed Egyptian, Indian, and Celtic motifs with cheerful disregard for historical accuracy. The air carried the cloying scent of incense, the same drugged variety Pemberton had mentioned. They were kept waiting perhaps 5 minutes before being shown into a parlour, where Mrs. Mordaunt held her séances. The room was circular, dominated by a round table draped in black velvet. The walls were hung with more exotic fabrics, and small tables held an assortment of mystical paraphernalia: crystal balls, tarot cards, small statues of various deities. Mrs. Mordaunt herself was a woman of, perhaps, 45, handsome in a theatrical way, with dark hair elaborately styled and clothing that suggested both respectability and a touch of the exotic. Her expression when she entered was composed, but Watson, with his medical training in reading patients, noticed the tension in her shoulders, the slight dilation of her pupils. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice carrying a trained melodiousness that probably served her well in her profession. "This is an unexpected honour. I've read Dr. Watson's accounts of your cases with great interest, though I confess I'm puzzled as to what brings you to my establishment." "I think not," Holmes said mildly, settling into a chair without invitation. "I think you know exactly why we're here, Mrs. Mordaunt. One of your operatives was arrested last night at the Pemberton residence. He was caught in the act of using a speaking tube hidden in the walls to create the impression of supernatural whispers. I believe you know all about that, don't you?" The mask of composure slipped for just a moment, but Mrs. Mordaunt recovered quickly. "I have no idea what you're talking about. If someone has been arrested, that's a police matter. I run a legitimate spiritual counselling service." "You run a criminal conspiracy," Holmes interrupted, his voice sharp now, cutting through her protestations. "You use your séances to extract confessions from vulnerable men, then pass that information to your confederates, who employ elaborate mechanisms to blackmail your victims. The Pemberton case is simply the most recent example. How many others have there been, Mrs. Mordaunt? How many men have paid to keep secrets they foolishly shared in this very room?" She drew herself up, attempting to project outrage. "These are slanderous accusations, Mr. Holmes. I've committed no crime. If men choose to share their troubles during spiritual consultations, that's between them and the spirits who guide me. I have no control over—" "The young man we arrested last night will talk," Holmes said flatly. "They always do, eventually. He'll describe the entire operation in exchange for leniency. He'll name you, your husband, your brother-in-law, Blake the dealer. He'll testify that you drugged your clients with incense to make them more pliable, that you recorded their confessions and sold them to blackmailers. The only question is whether you'll cooperate now and perhaps receive some consideration, or whether you'll wait until the full weight of evidence crushes any possibility of mercy." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of an ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Mordaunt stood frozen, her theatrical composure crumbling as she calculated odds and probabilities. "I want immunity," she said finally, her voice stripped of its melodious affect. "Full immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony against the others." "That's not my decision to make," Holmes replied, "but I can arrange for you to speak with Inspector Gregson at Scotland Yard. He'll be more receptive if you come voluntarily, with evidence in hand, than if you're dragged in after warrants are issued." She seemed to collapse inward, sinking into a chair as the fight went out of her. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said quietly. "When we started, it was just taking money from men who deserved to suffer for their sins. Men who'd cheated and lied and betrayed. We were administering justice, in a way. By torturing them psychologically. Watson couldn't keep the disgust from his voice. By driving them to madness. They drove themselves mad with guilt, she shot back, some spirit returning. We simply revealed what was already there, made them face their consciences. While extracting thousands of pounds, Holmes observed dryly. How very altruistic. Where are your husband and brother-in-law now? I don't know. We each maintain separate residences, meet only when necessary to coordinate. It's safer that way. She looked up at Holmes with something that might have been desperation or calculation. But I can give you Blake. He's the one who started it all, who came to us with the idea. He's been planning this for years, ever since he sold that skull to Augustus Pemberton. Blake's address in Clerkenwell? It's not his real workshop. That's just a front. His actual operation is in Southwark, near the river. He has a warehouse where he stores his collection, where he creates the provenance for artifacts that have no true history. I can give you the exact location. Over the next hour, Mrs. Mordaunt provided a comprehensive accounting of the conspiracy, her words tumbling out with the desperate speed of someone hoping to save themselves by sacrificing others. She described how Blake had approached her 5 years earlier with his scheme, how he'd identified Augustus Pemberton as the perfect unwitting accomplice, how they'd spent years building the infrastructure before executing their first successful blackmail. There had been 12 victims before Pemberton, she admitted. 12 men who'd paid amounts ranging from £3,000 to £8,000. Not all had attended her séances. Some had been identified through other means, observed and researched until their secrets were discovered. But the séances were the most efficient method, she acknowledged, with a kind of perverse pride. Men told spirits things they'd never tell another human being. By the time they left Mrs. Mordaunt's establishment, with her agreement to accompany them to Scotland Yard, the morning had advanced to noon. The fog had burned off entirely, and London sparkled under rare November sunshine, the city seeming almost cheerful, despite the darkness they'd been investigating. Inspector Gregson received them at Scotland Yard with professional courtesy and growing astonishment as Holmes laid out the full scope of the conspiracy. Mrs. Mordaunt's testimony was recorded, warrants were issued for the arrest of the Mordaunt brothers and Erasmus Blake, and a team of constables was dispatched to the Southwark warehouse. "This is extraordinary, Holmes," Gregson said, once the immediate flurry of activity had subsided. "A blackmail ring operating for 5 years, using supernatural props and psychological torture. If you hadn't stumbled onto it through the Pemberton case, they might have continued indefinitely." "Someone would have caught them eventually," Holmes replied, though he looked pleased with the compliment. "Criminal enterprises of this sophistication inevitably grow overconfident. They would have made a mistake. Nevertheless, you've done London a great service. The victims, will they need to testify?" "I hope that can be avoided. The conspirators' own testimony, combined with the physical evidence from the Pemberton house, should be sufficient for conviction. The victims have suffered enough without having their secrets paraded through court. They returned to Baker Street as the afternoon was fading toward evening, both men exhausted but satisfied. Mrs. Hudson greeted them with her usual mixture of exasperation and affection, providing tea and sandwiches while scolding them for missing meals and keeping irregular hours. As the room darkened and Holmes lit the lamps, Watson found himself reflecting on the case's peculiar nature. "It's strange," he said. "We've dealt with murderers and thieves, with crimes of passion and calculation. But this felt different somehow, more insidious. Because it exploited the best parts of human nature," Holmes replied, settling into his chair with his pipe. "Guilt, conscience, the desire for redemption. The mordant conspiracy didn't prey on greed or anger, it preyed on remorse. That's what makes it particularly disturbing. And particularly effective. Indeed. Which is why cases like this are important, Watson. They remind us that criminals aren't always crude thugs operating in dark alleys. Sometimes they're sophisticated manipulators who understand human psychology better than most doctors. They create systems, build enterprises, hide behind respectable facades." The fire crackled softly, and outside the window London prepared for another night. The constables would be arresting Blake by now, Watson thought, and the Mordaunt brothers would soon follow. The machine the conspirators had built so carefully over 5 years was being dismantled piece by piece. "What will happen to Pemberton?" Watson asked. "He'll recover, I expect. The psychological wounds will take time to heal, but knowing the truth, that he wasn't being haunted by supernatural forces, but by very human criminals, will help. Understanding one's tormentor is the first step toward overcoming fear." Holmes paused, then added with uncharacteristic gentleness, "And his secrets, such as they were, will remain secret. The trial needn't expose his personal indiscretions." "That's generous of you." "It's practical. The man made mistakes, certainly, but who among us hasn't? He didn't deserve what was done to him. None of the victims did." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire, listening to London's evening symphony of hoofbeats and distant voices. Finally, Watson stirred, reaching for his notebook. "I should write this up," he said. "Another case for the Chronicles. Though I'll have to be careful with the details, protect the victims' identities. Change the names, alter the locations slightly," Holmes suggested. "Keep the essential truth of the mechanism, the whispering skull, the hidden passages, the psychological manipulation. That's what's important. Let people understand how such crimes are committed, so they might recognize similar schemes in the future." Watson began making notes, his pen scratching across paper in the lamplight. Holmes watched him with an expression that might have been affection, might have been simple satisfaction at another case successfully concluded. "You know what I find most remarkable," Watson said after a while. "That skull had no power whatsoever. It was just bone, just an old artifact. But they made it into something terrifying through theatre and psychology. They made it whisper without ever giving it a voice." "That's the nature of fear, Watson. It exists primarily in our minds. The skull was merely a prop, a focal point for anxiety. The real power was always in the whispers themselves, and whispers, as we discovered, are just people hiding in walls with tubes and clever acoustic arrangements. Science over superstition." "Always," Holmes agreed. "Though I'll admit, there are moments when superstition has its appeal. The world would be more interesting if skulls actually could whisper prophecies. But it would also be considerably more troublesome for rational investigation. Watson smiled, continuing his notes. Outside, the lamplighters were making their rounds, bringing small pools of gaslight to the darkening streets. The fog was returning, as it always did, wrapping London in its grey embrace. But in the rooms at Baker Street, warmth and light held the darkness at bay. The case of the Whispering Skull was closed. Justice would be served, victims would heal, and the conspirators would face the consequences of their elaborate cruelty. In his chair, Holmes closed his eyes, allowing himself a rare moment of complete relaxation. The game had been played, the puzzle solved, the mystery illuminated. And somewhere in London, in houses they would never visit, in lives they would never directly touch, other secrets remained hidden. Other fears waited to be confronted. But for tonight, this story was finished. The fire burned lower, the clock ticked on, and the great city breathed through its fog-wrapped night, full of mysteries solved and unsolved, of whispers heard and unheard, of skulls that remained silent, and truths that waited to be discovered. Watson's pen scratched on, recording the adventure for posterity, while Holmes drifted into sleep, a slight smile on his lips. Another case concluded, another victory for reason over illusion. And in the morning, London would wake to new puzzles, new crimes, new opportunities for detection. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight belonged to rest, to satisfaction, to the quiet comfort of mysteries explained and fears dispelled. The Whispering Skull had fallen silent at last. Sleep well, dear listener. May your own whispers be only dreams, and may your morning bring the clear light of understanding.